An amateur practices so that they don't make any mistakes. A pro practices so that they can't make any mistakes.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players. I'm your host, David Holloway, and I'm thrilled as always to be here with you. I'm very excited to bring to you this episode, Mr. David Jameson. Now, David has had one hell of a career, somewhat outside of music, and he, says himself that he's an amateur, but I think he's stretching the definition of amateur to some extent because aside from playing in a bunch of amazing bands, David is also responsible for Gig Performer, one of the most well-known pieces of gigging software for musicians. You know, it's I'd argue in the big three there as far as main stage, Gig Performer, and then you've got other great apps like Camelot and then Fourscore and OnSong and so on. So we do talk a lot about David's career in music as it is, but also the amazing work he's done with Gig Performer. So there's lots to enjoy. And if you're a main stage user like me, I've sort of been a little bit thrown, not by Gig Performer, because it's actually incredibly clearly communicated how it works. And there's some wonderful tutorial videos. I've probably just been lazy and haven't taken the time to get into it. And certainly after talking to David, I'm going to be revisiting that scenario. So yeah, I do hope you enjoy this, and I'll see you at the end of the show. David, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here, sir. How are you doing this fine Friday evening?
I'm doing excellent. Just woke up from a very nice nap, so raring to go.
That's right. We're talking before the show. Naps are good for your health and well-deserved. And I'm not surprised you need a nap, David, because as we're going to hear over the coming hour or so, you're one busy man. But I thought we'd start off when maybe you were having naps earlier years as a child. What got you into music in the first place? What was your sort of education in music?
Well, I was born at an early age.
I love that one.
Yeah, I know. You write it down. Feel free to use it. So my father was a serious amateur violinist. So he had quartets in the house every week, which, by the way, is probably why I don't listen to classical music much anymore, because I kind of burned out on it. And, you know, like many kids that generation, we're talking back, I guess it'd be the 60s. That's scary. I started piano lessons when I was 4. Apparently, I was very good. And I actually was a few years later, I was in like a prize winners concert for young kids. And then I gave it up. I had apparently the best teacher at the Royal Irish Academy of Music. I grew up in Ireland, but I hated practicing. You know, my friends were outside playing soccer and, stuff. And I'm like stuck. And so I kind of, much to my father's disappointment, I gave it up. And then I took up the guitar for a little while and took a few lessons, and that was kind of cool. And then I kind of really didn't do that much anymore, but I was really into electronics as a kid. Apparently when I was 12 years old, I registered I didn't know it was an adult course, but it was an adult course in electronics done in England over the mail. How's that the old days? And I actually built an oscilloscope when I was 12. I got a bit of help from an electrician, and I was fascinated by electronics and stuff, and Practical Electronics magazine, all that kind of thing. There were not many opportunities in Ireland. There was like one shop in Dublin that you could buy parts. It's not like over in the US when they had Radio Shack and everything. And, and that was fun. I did that. And then I discovered electronic keyboards. And, I'm still into music. And I persuaded my father, who was keen to support anything I did in the music world. I don't remember what my first keyboard was. Oh, yes, I do. It was a Farfisa organ.
Nice. Absolutely.
I was just fascinated by the sound and all the buttons and knobs and switches and so on. And so I kind of got back in and was kind of just more self-taught at that point. I wasn't taking lessons anymore. I was getting ready to start college. I was playing a lot. And then I got some other keyboards, and you had to go to England for the most part to get keyboards. They weren't really anything in Ireland. There wasn't that much. And I joined a band. Actually, there's a few bands as a kid, but I joined this band called Time Machine. And I was using 11 keyboards on stage. I was in my Rick Wakeman phase. What can I tell you? So this was between school and college. I actually left college for a couple of years, much to my mother's horror. And I had the whole thing. You had my first synthesizer, I've never forgotten this, was the EMS Putney, if you know what that was.
No.
So it was the AKS model. Pink Floyd used it. It's the one with the grid, so the patch panel. And I had gone over to England and I was like looking at different synthesizers. I didn't really understand much about them or how they worked. And around the same time, the Mini Moog had come out and I saw it. And then I saw this EMS thing. And it kind of, to me at the time, it looked more interesting. I'm sorry I didn't get the Mini Moog at the time, but I got this thing with the grid and it was great, except it would go out of tune very quickly. So I'd be like on stage and I'm playing one song and I've got a headphone in one ear tuning up the octave, those days. And I ended up, building this thing. I had the first Yamaha CS80 in the country.
Nice.
Which I got in England. Yeah. One of our roadies quit when I brought that home. They weighed a ton. They really did. And we were doing shows. We were doing one every week. It was mostly pop, but they did a couple of prog ones. We used to do, do you know the band Camel?
Yes, absolutely.
So there was a great song that they did called First Light. And it starts off, it's a guitar intro, and then this Moog comes in. And the song is dun, dun. It's a really exciting song. And so, I had, the string machine. I didn't have a Moog. At the time, I had the Roland version of a Mini Moog. I forget what it was. SH something or other. I don't remember anymore. A long time ago. But you could do all those kinds of things. I had a Hammond organ, I had a Fender Rhodes, and they schlepped all this stuff. You're young. And I did that for a while. And then, to be honest, I actually had a song in the Irish charts, a song that I'd written, although I'm convinced to this day that only got into the charts because my mother bought 50 copies of it. I'm totally convinced.
I've got to know, David, what was the name of the song?
The song was called Let Me Tell You. Here, look, I still have it. Look at that.
Nice.
Yeah,
so it's from Time Machine. Yeah, okay.
That's like, and my nickname was David Knobs Jameson because I had so many. Because I just loved twiddling all the stuff.
Yeah.
If you saw a picture of my studio down in my basement, you'd understand. I've got more knobs and it's great.
Yes.
There's a lot to be said for the physical tweaking. And then I got bored because I didn't like the social scene and I was a token Irishman who didn't drink. And and so I went back to college. I had discovered programming while living in France for a year between school and college. My parents had me go to France for like an inter-between because just the age stuff, they thought. And I discovered the Hewlett-Packard 25. Do you remember the HP? It was a programmable calculator. It was the first time I ever saw anything programmable. I was fascinated, spent ages just learning how to do programming stuff. And once I was there, software, that's where I was. So I went back to college, got my multiple degrees in computer science, and kind of went on from there.
And what a shame they never paid off, David. And I'm being sarcastic, obviously. And we definitely, just for the sake of our listeners and viewers, I know a lot of people will be listening and viewing because of David's role with Gig Perform, and we're certainly going to cover that. But I'm really keen, before we get to that, David, just to talk about 3 bands that you either are currently in or have recently been in, because I think you go back to when you were young and piano, you said you were pretty good. I think that's a pretty accurate description because the 3 bands you've chosen to play a regular role with are not easy, to say the least. So I thought we'd start with Reelin in the Years. So Steely Dan is obviously, one of the greatest bands of all time, and keyboard players love Steely Dan as a general rule. Tell us about your involvement in that and how you've had to approach that from a playing viewpoint.
Yeah, well, so that's kind of interesting because that wasn't when I fell back into bands, because I stopped for about 30 years. I didn't, wow. Real job, family, all the usual stuff. And then I started playing again, and then I fell into this thing. a lot of luck. I'd been advertising. I found some local bands who were trying to do stuff. And somebody I knew was trying to put together a band to do Peter Gabriel's early music. This came before Reelin, so I'm kind of going more historical.
Well, let's do that first, David. Let's do the security project. Let's do that.
Everything else will make more sense. And so I'd been playing in a local band with this guy. He was a good guy. His name was Scott. And he was trying to put together this thing to do the early Peter Gabriel. And he knew Jerry Murata, who was, of course, Gabriel's drummer for 10 years. And he had found a band in Rochester that was a Genesis tribute band. And his plan at the time, he was going to bring in the singer and their keyboard player, and Jerry was going to be the drummer, and he had Trey Gunn, a bass player, and so on. He used to play with King Crimson, so these amazing players. And at the last minute, the keyboard player from that band couldn't do it. So I got asked, would I be interested in kind of doing some early Peter Gabriel? Now, I didn't really know that music. I was a big Genesis fan, but I didn't know Gabriel stuff well. But it's like, who can turn that down? So I learned a bunch of songs, and I went for an audition, which was up at Jerry's studio. And that was kind of interesting because, first of all, it's very intimidating, because you're like, I'm this amateur musician, and you've got all these, famous people. But, I'd learned the songs pretty well, the 3 or 4 that we did for the audition. And I also had a very interesting instrument called an eigenharp that I was using. I don't know if you've ever come across that. So unfortunately, that company went out of business for various reasons, which didn't surprise me, but it is a pity. It's a great idea. So it was basically a controller with 5 columns, 24 rows of buttons that were sensitive to hair's breadth. You could, like, the way you touch a hair, you can feel it. That's sensitive. But it was sensitive in, out, right, left, and up, down separately, each key. I had been looking for a controller for years to play synthesizers, but allow me to do like vibrato the way I would do it on a guitar. Because I was playing guitar and so on, and I could never find anything, and I tried them all. This thing, you could do it. So I was using this thing, and there's a bunch of videos. I did it with Security Project and with the Pink Floyd band. And it was kind of wild because it's got all these lights and you can do all these crazy things with it. It was wild. So anyway, I fell into this thing. I ended up going on tour with them. Even lived in a tour bus in Europe for a month. I do not recommend that to anyone over 20, by the way. Certainly not in your 50s. But it was a blast. And all the stuff they tell you that happens in rock and roll happens in rock and roll. It's for real. So anyway,
my understanding is, David, though, you can't comment on a lot of that. But
I can't. But let me tell you, there were some things, and as they say, it's a good job I was married and faithful. Anyhow, so it was great. It was a great experience, and it was one of those things. All us amateur players, I'd love to do that with and it was a lot of fun. I got a good ribbing in the early days. We weren't doing Lamb Lies Down on Broadway in the early days, but we went into a restaurant on the first tour, and outside the restaurant, Trey said to me, "By the way, we've decided we're doing Lamb Lies Down on Broadway tomorrow." Now, I had never played it. I don't know if you know the song.
Yeah.
It's got this whole thing in it, right? I ended up learning it. It took me about a month to learn it. To do it really right. And once you learn it, it's easy, but it took me a while. I was petrified. It turns out they were all in on this. And so at the restaurant, they were all talking about it, and they did it totally to freak me out, and they succeeded in totally freaking me out. I was just panicked.
I love it.
Great experience. We did a bunch of tours, and I got to go to Europe with them, and we even went to Japan, did a few shows there. That was a blast. I discovered then, so moving to Reelin, I discovered that Jerry had the Steely Dan band. And they were playing up at a casino a few hours north of where I live. I went up to hear them. And it's like Jerry was there with his brother Rick, who's also a famous drummer. And it was like, at that time, it was a 13-piece band.
Wow.
Yeah. 4 horns, 2 drummers, 3 singers, 2 keyboard, blah, blah, blah. 2 guitars, massive. And after the show, I went up to Jerry and said, "Hey, Jerry, Pete Levin was playing keyboards at the time, Tony Levin's brother." And I said to Jerry, "Hey, if you ever need a sub, I'd love to have a go at some of this stuff." So Jerry said to me, "Yeah, well, go and learn. Here's like 20 songs. Go learn them, and we'll see. So I went, okay, and I went off, and I learned them, and I do stuff. It's both note for note and also sounds. Now, by this time, by the time Reelin happened, I was totally on Gig Performer, so I could pull off these sounds to a T. You know, I have Donald Fagen's, you know, Rhodes and Whirly. I've got the emulator for the Phase 9, the MXR Phase 9 phaser that he used, and so on. And anyway, got all that stuff. So I learned a whole bunch of songs, and that's the last I heard of it. So then about 8 months later, I get a call. It says, are you free to do a show in December at the Bearsville Theatre? This is in Woodstock. I said, sure, I'll go back and relearn everything. And what about a rehearsal? He said, well, we'll set up a rehearsal, you know, one thing to go through. I said, okay. I started learning all the songs, and I get them off. And I'm doing all these things because I'm trying to get all the sounds. So stuff that we're doing with 2 or 3 keyboard players, I'm automating stuff and doing stuff with Gig Performer and blah, blah, blah. When's the rehearsal? I'm working on a date. And closer. You can tell where this is going. When's the rehearsal? Anyway, to cut a long story short, no rehearsal. I show up at the Bearsville Theatre. We ran through a couple of songs, packed house, did the show. Somebody comes up to me afterwards and said, okay, Pete Levin left the band 3 days ago. You're it. And that is how I ended up joining Reelin in the years.
It's still going.
And it's still going. We've a couple of shows coming up starting in June, I think, and that band starts off again. And that's how I ended up. So the Steely Dan, you asked me about the music. You know, I knew Steely Dan, the older stuff, not so much the new stuff. So it was great to get outside my comfort zone and learn a style that I hadn't gotten used to. Once I learned the basic style of those chords, turns out for keyboards, that stuff's actually not that hard. A little more disappointingly, for the most part, with a few exceptions, it's very formulaic.
Okay.
I didn't realize it until I'm sitting down with 20 songs, but every song, intro, first verse, interlude, second verse, interlude, solo, using the same chords as the verse, outro. And they're all like that. There's a couple of exceptions. Asia, for example, that song itself, a little bit, it's still got some of that, but it's extended. But they were all, you know, same kinds of chords. So once you learned their style, there was like, you know, okay, yeah, I can do this. And pretty much you do it. Some of the solos were tricky having to learn because they had some phenomenal players. And, you know, you learn the solos, and I like to do note for note and blah, blah, blah. And that's how that happens.
That's great. And so I think that's a fascinating point about the formulaic nature of some of the songs, and probably links into my next question, which is around Pink Floyd, which is far from formulaic. I would never make that claim, but I've always felt, and this is due to my co-host Paul, who's an apology for today because he's literally touring with a Pink Floyd tribute band, is that the sounds and the playing isn't necessarily as complex as what it may appear on the surface. Is that a fair thing to say about Pink Floyd as well, or not?
So the Pink Floyd thing for me is another interesting thing because I'm actually not a big Pink Floyd fan. What happened was around the same time that Security Project was getting off the ground, I got this call, see if I was interested in joining the Pink Floyd band. And it's a band, I had turned them down a year earlier because like, I'm not Pink Floyd. And when they called me back again, I said, sure, because I didn't expect the Security Project thing to happen. So I ended up in both of these bands at the same time, which was bizarre. So I had to go off and learn a bunch of Pink Floyd songs. So that was kind of an interesting one for me in funny ways. So I'm not a blues person, and I'm not an improv person. So in other words, I love Tony Banks' stuff. You know, playing the solos for Cinema Show or First to Fifth or Supper's Ready, and they're gorgeous solos, and I've learned them, you know, but they're all worked out. When it's improv, I'm just no good at it. So Pink Floyd is what I used to tell people. Yeah, Pink Floyd is basically a blues band with sound effects. Yeah, I've got into trouble now. Yeah, but
that'll be the tag at the start of the show. I'm already telling you now, David.
Well, please, I'm not sure, but you know, look, my hero is Keith Emerson.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm like listening to, Chick Corea's Return to Forever or Joe Zawinul Weather Report. And, they're gorgeous players. And Keith Emerson, of course, was a phenomenal composer as well.
Mm.
A lot of color and so on, Now, the Pink Floyd stuff in terms of the effects, in some ways was very easy for me because I knew what they had used. And I had used the same instrument a long time ago, the EMS Putney. So I was able to recreate all that stuff pretty easily. I mean, interestingly enough, last year, and we're doing it again this summer, we were asked to do a theatrical version of The Wall.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which we did, which meant I had to learn the rest of The Wall. I kind of knew some of it. And so there were songs, and because I wasn't a Pink Floyd fan, I'd never really listened to it all. So there were songs like Empty Spaces, so there's this engine running,
Yeah.
And I have a Euro rack down in my basement. And so I knew, okay, I can hear that. And, it's old style 60s, 70s kind of stuff. Yep, they have a white noise thing going in. There's a bit of like bass there, and there's a filter thing chugging along, and there's basically a sequence, and I was able to pretty much duplicate that stuff. And the arpeggiators are easy with Gig Performer, of course, and so on. And so I'm like, as opposed to what they were doing in the studio where they're doing one part and another, I could like push a key and have boom, 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 and the arpeggiators with the chords, the whole thing was just done with one key, which left me with my other hand free to play solos. So, able to do that stuff. And so, like we do Shining You Crazy Diamond, which I used to play the solo on the eigenharp. But if you listen to the main tune, it's a very simple couple of oscillators with a filter that's low cutoff, low down. It's just this nice, smooth sound. So, it wasn't really very hard to do. Now, at the time they did it, of course, incredibly creative because they were using the technology was new. From a technical perspective, the keyboard playing's not hard. I mean, one of the first things I built and before Gig Performer, I was still using Max MSP because Gig Performer came out of the Performing with Security project. I realized I'd been using something else. It's like, this isn't good enough. I need a better system. And that's what started the Gig Performer project. But one of the things I built a long time ago was an auto sustainer. And there are latch things on some keyboards to do this. But basically the idea was I could play a chord and it would just stay on until I start playing another chord. And then that one would go off and a new one would start. And in Pink Floyd, you play a chord and an organ chord stays on for 3 minutes or something. And then you do another one, it's another 3 minutes. There was a lot of that. And so I could play the chord like in Shining You Crazy that I use. And there's a great plugin, the Swam stuff that Audio Modeling did, Sax Brothers, and which I still use, by the way. And so, I'd hit the chord, and then I could do the sax and use the pitch wheel and do the sound, and then every now and then hit another chord, when it went from G minor to C. Whoa, really cool change there. So that wasn't, that's how that worked.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, and thank you for confirming. I mean, it is an amazing, what would you call it? Amazing discography that Pink Floyd have done, and it's incredibly satisfying to watch and listen to. But yeah, you've given me heart, and I know Paul, my co-host, is an amazing player, but you've still given me heart. So you mentioned there, let's talk a little bit about Gig Performer. And you mentioned your multiple degrees in computer science, so you obviously had a passion there for coding and so on. And so tell us actually how you kicked that off, because it's one thing to go, I'd like to create my own thing, but to actually take it from that to what it is now, just tell us about a little bit about the build up of Gig Performer in the earlier days.
So if you remember, I had like this big rack of keyboards around me. And then various sequencers and DAWs and stuff were around. Apple MainStage came out, and I got that early. It's like they did some very clever things in MainStage. In particular, the notion of having a knob that on one side responded to your controller and on the other side controlled parameters. And by the way, we use that in Gig Performer. That at the time thought that was brilliant. Now it turns out Motu's Performer had something similar. They didn't have plugins at the time, but they did have that indirection thing. But it was really nice. And so I had been playing around with using that just at home. But I ran into a lot of problems with it, which is really not a surprise. One, the design was a little bizarre. At the time, in my home studio, if you call that, a long time ago, so I had, among other things, I was using a Korg Oasis, which is, by the way, gorgeous instrument. I'm so sorry I sold it. I've had a Cronus since, but even though it's the same concept, it did not have the feel. It's sort of like going from a Steinway to a Yamaha. And the Yamahas are great pianos, but they're not Steinways. So anyway, so I had a Korg Oasis, and I had at that time a Moog Voyager. And I had set up a bunch of sounds and some patches that I was doing stuff. And the Voyager at the time was quite new. And so I had everything connected through a MIDI timepiece, if you remember the MIDI timepiece. Motu did some great stuff. So the MIDI timepiece, I had two of them. And everything was going through MainStage. And I was doing a song, and I was switching patches, and the Voyager, the Moog, sound would be wrong every time. I was convinced for about a month that there was a fault in the programming of the Voyager, the patch memory. It wasn't remembering everything. What was happening was, if you know the Moog, what was happening when I switched to this patch, oscillator 3 would go into low frequency mode. So instead of being an oscillator that you could hear, it was just making bizarre noises. So after about a month, I finally decided what's going on here, and I put a MIDI monitor on the whole thing, and I discovered what was happening. You'll love this. So I would change a patch in MainStage. MainStage would send a program change out to the instrument, and it would send a program change to the Oasis. The Oasis would switch to another program, and then it would send out some CC messages. In particular, it was sending out CC messages. You know where this is going, right? It would send out messages in CC80 and CC81, which would go back to MainStage. MainStage goes, I don't know what to do with these. I'll just rebroadcast them to everyone. What the fuck? Turns out, I don't remember which CC, but either 80 or 81, one of those, when sent to a Voyager, puts oscillator 3 in low frequency mode.
Yeah, wow.
Why would you build something that just rebroadcasts arbitrary stuff coming in on the assumption that other things will know what to do with it?
Does it still do that? Do you know, David, to this day?
I'm sure they. I don't know. I'm sure they.
Well, it would explain a lot of bizarre behaviours to me in my own MainStage rig. Maybe that's the cause.
It was bizarre. So I decided, you know what? So are you familiar with Max MSP from Cycling?
Yeah. Funnily enough, I am. I won't bore you with, but I was involved in a virtual band project back in the 90s that was initially based on Max MSP.
Okay. So my next step, I had been using Max for a long time. And so I decided, you know what, I'm going to build a plugin host in Max, which I will use for touring. So I built a thing, and there's a blog article, 3-part blog article somewhere on the internet around just showing how I did it. Basically, put together a lot of abstractions, and so I could have basically up to 6 plugins and up to 2 effects plugins for every patch. And then I had abstractions that could reload different sets of plugins and different effects. And then I was able to, each song then was a patcher that when you selected it, it would basically set things up, load in the appropriate plugins and blah, blah. And it worked pretty well. And I actually used it with Security Project, the first tour or two. Still, I was using a Cronus and 3 Roland A800 controllers. I was using 4 keyboards. And it actually worked pretty well. The only problem was it took about 7 seconds to switch from one thing to another, which wasn't that big a deal, but it was a thing. And by the way, this is involved in the interesting Onstage problem that I had once. We'll come back to that. And it worked pretty well. And then Cycling 74 brought out the next version of Max, and I had nothing but trouble with it. I'm still using the latest version, and I think it probably works pretty well. But version 6 was crashing on me. I was having a lot of trouble. And it was all those real-time issues. They couldn't reproduce it. blah, blah, blah. And so, if you can't reproduce it, nothing they can do about it. But I ended up with a system that I could not depend upon. So that was around 2016 or so. I had a development partner in Canada that we had worked on a bunch of other projects, and he was a guitarist. He, unfortunately, at the age of 52, he died a couple of years ago, which is very sad. Anyway, he and I said, you know what? Let's build our own to scratch an itch. And that was the beginning of the Gig Performer project. And we aimed it at both keyboard players and guitarists because he was a guitarist and I was a keyboard player. And so the stuff in there really designed for both. And of course, once you do that, it works, vocalists, bass players, it works great with as well, because you're dealing with audio in as opposed to just MIDI in. So it ended up being great for both. And today it's in use by guitarists as well.
This is probably a good juncture. I would love for our listeners and viewers, you to give a broad overview of Gig Performer. So a whole bunch of our audience will either use hardware keyboards without a laptop and plugins. There'll be another whole swathe like myself that probably started out with Mainstage and have been too lazy to look at other options. Then we'll have a very dedicated audience of Gig Performer users, and then others that will use iPad-based things like Fourscore, OnSong, and so on. And obviously they are all very different, but I'd love you to just give an overview of how Gig Performer broadly works and how it's different from the others without you having to get too deep, obviously.
Okay, so when we first decided to build it, we had 2 or 3 goals. One was total reliability on stage. If you're on stage, particularly in front of a paying audience, that's a remarkably stressful. By the way, until I started doing with Security Project, I had no idea how stressful it really was. I played with bands and you go and, and there's a few people dancing and you're playing away. But, you get up in a theater or something and there's an audience sitting there and you have to be on for 2 hours. It's really hard, which was a huge wow for me. So the less stress you have, the better. So I didn't want to worry, if I move a slider, because I was going to go kaboom. Our biggest and our first goal was utter reliability on stage. And I will tell you, as of today, and I'm not superstitious, so I don't mind saying it, I have toured, I've carried a backup laptop with me ever. I've never needed it. I've never had a single problem that wasn't a user. Actually, the user problem I had was before Gig Performer, so that doesn't even count. But anyway, and so that was our first goal. Our second goal was, this is for musicians. You should not have to have a PhD in mix engineering to be a musician. So we didn't want to use channel strips, okay? And that's the big paradigm shift, where it's like, I don't care about buses and sends and inserts and auxes and what the fuck is that? I want to connect. I've got a plugin. It's a piano. I want to connect it to my phaser, and then I want to connect it to my reverb. And here's my organ, and I want to connect that into my reverb. So just wire them in together, and off you go, and start playing. So we basically decided to build this visual system that's basically graphical. Okay, and so we have this notion of a Rackspace where you basically, and a Rackspace essentially, I don't want to get too technical, but basically that's a topology. So a Rackspace represents a collection of interconnected plugins. Each Rackspace, and you can have lots of Rackspaces, can have a completely different set of plugins connected in different ways. Okay? So, and you can switch from one Rackspace to another, even in the middle of a beat, without any glitches or stuff. So you can be playing, and I've got a Genesis medley that I used to use on tour, where I went through about 30 of these Rackspaces. I was doing 8 or 16 bars of different Genesis tunes that ended in Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, which the rest of the band then came up on stage and we performed it. So that was the basic concept, this graphical view, no channel strips. So it's like a guitarist. I got effects pedals on the floor. I plug this into this and this into this and this into this, and it works. I don't have to plug each one here, one here, one here. Okay, let me see. I have to put a send in here and turn this up. And what's the bus? You just see what's in front of you, and that's where the audio goes.
So you've just already opened my eyes, David. So for the sake of other Mainstage users out there, and I may be alone, I've downloaded Gig Performer a couple of times and just due to upcoming gigs and haven't made the switch as yet. But I probably was getting thrown by the Rackspace, thinking the Rackspace was the overall configuration of my keyboards no matter what. And then,
Nope.
and that's where I've gotten confused
Nope.
because, as you know, in main stage, basically what you're saying is a Rackspace is equivalent to a patch in main stage, not the overall configuration of main stage.
It's kind of, yes, kind of. Yeah, but there's another whole piece to it, which I'll come to. But
that's fine. Yeah.
By the way, the biggest problem, it's been very interesting because almost half of our user base are Mac users.
Yeah.
Which we did not expect. But the biggest problem we've seen are users who basically, and I've seen this and I've asked questions online, that decided not to go with Gig Performer and like, well, why not? And the reason why not was they tried to use Gig Performer as if it was a channel strip system.
Yeah.
And the reality is you've got to forget everything you knew. It's completely different. And once you understand how it works. So, for example, we have a notion of a MIDI in block. A MIDI in block represents MIDI coming in from some device. And basically you can set up a split. You can say this only receives on this channel and it only receives stuff between C3 and C4, for example. The default is the whole keyboard. But, so here's the thing. Supposing you want to do a split, okay, and you want to have like, on the left half you want to have like a piano at normal registers, and on the upper half you want to have an organ, for example. So people get like, well, how do you do that? Well, the answer is very simple. You take two MIDI in blocks, you make one of them be the lower split, the other be the upper split, you connect one to your piano and the other to your organ. And off you go, right? So people, until they see, oh yeah, just use multiple blocks, one for this range, one for this range. You know, once you see that, then kind of your eyes like you go, oh yeah, and then it suddenly hits you how it works. But there is that paradigm shift, and if you're trying to make, I want a keyboard, and then I've got a plug-in, and followed by, you know, an effect and another effect, you know, and the thing. Ours, you can have like you know, you might have a piano and an organ and strings, and then the piano and the organ both go to a delay, the other one goes to a flanger, and one goes to the, you know, and they're just arbitrarily connected. And you can put faders in between if you want to control, but you don't think about, but it's just, this is going to the flanger, and this is going to the flanger and the reverb, and this is going blah, 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 and it just works. So it's much easier to understand.
Right.
Once you get your head around and you don't try to make it be a channel strip model.
Yeah.
So that was the first key part. The second key part was our front panel where you have the widgets. And the idea behind the widgets was very simple. You have a knob or a slider or a button, and you can attach a knob, let's just use a knob or widget, to a plug-in parameter. And MainStage does this as well. This is pretty basic. And then on the other side, you can connect and map a controller MIDI message to your widget. And when you do that, then when you turn your knob or push a slider, that changes the parameter. It's pretty straightforward. But a big goal, and this is where the MIDI people get a bit bothered, our position is forget about MIDI. Okay? You have a knob. I don't care what message it sends. Learn it, and then you'll just use it. You don't care about MIDI anymore. You're controlling a parameter through host automation. Yeah. So, you know, there's a lot of people want to just pass these parameters, MIDI messages, directly to plugins. It's like, don't do that. First of all, you're going to have a problem as soon as you decide to use a different plugin, or you're going to have a problem if you switch keyboards. And we have a whole system, by the way, again, came from my experience with Backline when I had to switch keyboards on the fly. I say, oh, wait, this isn't going to work because this sends different messages. And we have a whole system now. You can switch your keyboard, tell Gig Performer, this is what these controls send. Like, so 8 knobs on the Yamaha send these CC messages, 8 knobs and something else send these CC messages. You can, at sound check, really quickly, just tell Gig Performer, this is what this is doing, this is what this is doing, and then all your Rackspaces will just work normally. Wow. Yeah. So again, to address the backline or thing where you're just handed a keyboard controller. So that whole widget thing basically is your interface to control the system from your keyboards.
That's amazing.
So that's the other main part. So the wiring view, which is the Rackspaces, and the panel view, which is the controls. And the goal, and certainly the way I use it, my laptop's like either beside me or behind me, and I never look at it during the show. Now, obviously, over the years, a lot of new stuff has been added in. So, for example, we don't have a concept of a widget controlling multiple parameters directly. And the reason we don't is because a widget is meant to represent a physical control. We can scale the values that a widget sends out, and you can actually see that on the display as a circle around the widget, which shows you what it's really sending. But the widget itself is always following your physical keyboard. If you want to control multiple parameters, you attach a widget to each one, and you link the widgets together. And then when you turn one, the other one turns, and then the scaling controls what the parameters actually do. So if I want to do a crossfade, for example, I'll have one widget that's controlling the volume that goes up as you turn the widget. The other widget, when you turn it up, it goes down because the scaling curve is reversed. They're linked together, so as one goes up, the other goes down, for example. So we do it that way, and you just have one widget attached to your controller. You don't have to have them both. The other ones will turn. So we control multiple parameters, but we do it that way rather than having a single widget control multiple parameters directly. It's a different approach.
And I think I know your answer, David, based on what you're describing. But for someone like me that uses both plugins and obviously physical keyboards, so I have a MIDI X7 Plus and then I use an Arturia Keylab. I'm assuming it's quite easy via widgets to select sounds on my MIDI X from Gig Performer as far as changing between songs.
So there are multiple ways to do that. Surprise. So I mentioned earlier there's a MIDI in block, and a MIDI in block basically receives MIDI. Well, there's also a MIDI out block for different ports and different channels. And on a MIDI out block, of course, if you connect a MIDI in to a MIDI out, of course, it'll just go straight. Now, we've got transposers and we've got like generate chords from single notes, and you can use lots of third parties in between. But eventually, there's a MIDI out block where you can send stuff out. And I actually use that with our Pink Floyd band. We feed my chords to a harmonizer, a vocal harmonizer piece of hardware, and the singers will sing and get chords when I'm playing a chord, for example. But when you switch a Rackspace, and I didn't talk about variations, which is a very important, those widgets, for a single Rackspace, you can have multiple sets, and you switch variation, and that changes widget values. But widget values can do things like bypass one plugin and turn on another one. They can do all sorts of things, so we can have the same set of plugins, but have completely different things without changing even just in the same topology. One of the things you can do, of course, you can connect a widget to, say, the PC parameter of a MIDI out block, and if you turn a widget, that changes the program number. But there are actually better ways to do it now. When we built our streaming file player, which is an audio file player, mostly for backing tracks, but you can have like 1,000 songs in it. And by the way, if that's not enough and you need another 1,000, just add another streaming file player. And it doesn't use RAM. It's mostly because it's direct from disk. So you can have like tons, right? We have a timeline there, and you can put markers. And then markers can have actions. This is new in Gig Performer 5. Wow. And there are all sorts of actions, and actions can be things like send a program change to this external device and that external device, and then send a CC number to set something else. So you can do all that kind of thing. By the way, you can also send OSC messages. We've got full OSC support. And the reason we have that originally is because when we first started building Gig Performer, I still had all my patches for my songs in Max, and I needed Max to be the driver but control the plugins in Gig Performer, which it did by sending OSC messages.
There you go.
So we've got a really deep OSC thing, which now, by the way, you can use with Lemur or Touch OSC, and you have control, and as you're playing, your display just shows you the widgets you care about in different songs.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, so, right. There's also, by the way, just to add, for stuff for which we don't have GUI because we didn't think of it, there's a fully fledged programming language in Gig Performer, right? We call it GP Script, which is a terrible name because it's actually a compiler. but it's designed to be very easy to use. We didn't use like a C style thing. It's more a Pascal type thing, but very clean. So you can do things, for example, when a Rackspace changes, it can trigger something and you can make stuff happen. And making stuff happen can be send an OSC message to front of house, or set a widget to this, or start playing a sound, or turn on the streaming file, whatever the hell you want. So there's a whole, completely different set of things you can do with that for more advanced use.
Yeah. Now that's amazing. And thank you for even taking us down to that level, because I know we could spend 10, 12, 14 hours talking on this, and I'm yet again super tempted. I need to get a break between gigs and actually bite the bullet, and I intend on doing that. David, and obviously evolving a piece of software of this complexity takes a lot of effort. Without going into specific numbers, obviously, I understand that. But, I mean, are you a sizable team now? And how do you sort of know in 10 years that you're going to be able to keep up the pace on this? Because it's an amazing effort.
So the team, the developer part has changed. When we first started, it was Nebojsa, my development partner, and me. Now, I don't want to get into a whole thing about software developers. Well, no. But the range of abilities of different software developers, there can be orders of magnitude difference. And I hate the term coding, by the way. To me, coding is like, you want to do a website, you can get some offshore company. They'll throw 5 gigabytes of back-end shit into your computer and then write 20 lines of code. And yeah, there's your website. So to me, if you're developing and inventing, to me, that's not coding. Coding is when you just glue stuff together that somebody else wrote. So the key thing is the approach that we take to software development. And my partner and I, Nebojsa at the time, who's also a phenomenally great software developer, we worked on completely different parts. So his expertise was the GUI stuff and the juice, the audio engine and stuff like that. My expertise was the networking and the programming language, because we built our own programming language. We didn't take one. So my research work when I was a computer scientist was programming language design, built a lot of languages. So for a lot of the stuff, we were just doing our own thing and everything fit together. And then every few days we'd argue over something, both understanding that it was never personal. It was just we're pushing each other to make the best decisions. And that's how we got stuff. And that worked very well. Anytime we outsourced a couple of things, the results were horrible. The first audio player that we have, we outsourced it. Biggest mistake we ever made. Poor Nebojsa spent 2 months fixing bugs in it after. And if you look at the code, it's like you just pull your hair out. This was years ago. So we've been cautious since then. Now, about a year ago, so after my partner died, I had a whole business because I had to deal with who owns this company and blah, 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 blah. And, I now own it 100%. And once that happened, it took about a year to sort that out. I was able to start looking for new people. And I have a couple of amazing people that are working pretty much full time, which is speeding things up tremendously. So we normally don't talk about future stuff. We've always made that be a thing. My position is I put my consumer hat on. I don't want to do stuff that I hate having done to me as a consumer.
Yeah.
So I want you to buy Gig Performer based on what it can do for you today, not on what it might be able to do for you tomorrow. So we never make any promises, and we generally don't talk about what we will do, because if we don't do it, we don't want people to say, I bought it because you said you were going to do blah, blah, blah. So we never promise. But something that we expect to have, again, I'm going to say, even though it's up and running and working in our current beta, I'm not saying anything, it'll be a future big thing. But we now have a concept that's similar to the keyboard view that you see in MainStage.
Gotcha.
Now, the thing is, our view is much more complicated because we have to represent an arbitrary graph as opposed to a linear. You got a keyboard with a thing and another one and a channel. I can have one MIDI in block going to 5 different plugins,
That's right.
or I can have 5 different MIDI in blocks going to a single plugin and anywhere in between. So visualizing that is a much more complicated thing, but one of our team members, Eldad, who's phenomenal, came up with a great way to do it and has that up and running, and it works very nicely for people who want that. So, and we've somebody else now who just joined, who we're very excited about, who's doing another separate area. And what that means for me, and because these guys both are high-end people, you don't have to tell them what to do. And they'll write the code in the right kind of approach that's easy to maintain. That's now freeing me up because I was like working like 7 days a week, 14 hours, crazy. I want to get back. GP Script needs an overhaul because when I developed GP Script, I was thinking 20 lines of code to do like, I need a MIDI transposer. I want to add a second note to what I'm playing. People have written GP scriptings with 10,000 lines in them.
Wow.
And it works, which is remarkable, but it was never designed for that. And so I want to rebuild a piece of that to handle much bigger systems. I guess it's proof that it worked. People started doing things that we never expected. A lot of stuff coming, which is very cool. We just actually released a new little update just a few days ago, actually, 5.0.40, which, mostly it fixes a couple of things that people discovered and it adds a couple of little features. And that's out now as well. So it's going pretty well. I'm using it. I keep discovering we've got these high profile users using it all around the world. We didn't even know about them because they just buy it. We're not fans of giving away and sure, have it for free. That's like, hey, band, great, awesome. Listen, come to my house and do a free show, would you? I mean,
that's right.
We'll do a video for you. So we don't discount, really. We don't do any of that stuff. So people buy it, and then we discover, whoa, we got all these like famous people using the thing, which is awesome. And they didn't get paid to say nice things about it. They put their money where their mouth was. I love that.
Exactly. And we're in the same boat. So I want to emphasize to everyone listening or watching, we've got there's been nothing set up between David and I. I just wanted to interview David because he's a fascinating guy and I've seen the work that's gone into Gig Performer. And I can honestly say, David, just been involved in a whole bunch of different Facebook groups and forums, music players, that I've never heard a bad report about Gig Performer. I just honestly haven't. I've never seen a single gripe, detailed gripe about this doesn't work or that doesn't work, whereas I'd be the first to admit as a MainStage user, there's no shortage of those. And sure, I'm guessing the user base for MainStage is larger, but I think it's a testament to the work you've done.
Yeah, as I said, my goal was I'm getting up on stage. I got to deal with, especially in the Pink Floyd stuff. The Steely Dan's easy. The Pink Floyd and Security Project was hard too. I had 4 keyboards doing crazy stuff. I need to focus on performing, not on worrying about will everything work. And that really was our primary goal. And I think we've been pretty successful.
And so let's talk about when things haven't worked well, David. I know you mentioned in your Weekend Warrior profile, but I think it's worth another go through because it's amazing. Tell us about when you had a bit of a train wreck.
So in the early days when I was touring with Security Project, I had an L shape, which I wish I still had because I much prefer that shape. Now I just have like 2 to 4 in a single pile, but I used to have an L shape thing. And it's nice because you could do stuff with your right hand high up on one while doing.
Always loved L shape.
Trey basically kept pushing me. You got to shrink down. Because we go from a theater where you're like, I need binoculars to see the other band members, to a club where it's like there's, I did one show with Pink Floyd where they put me on the floor because there's just no room. So anyway, those days I had an L shaped thing. So I had, a couple of keyboards here and a couple of keyboards here, or controllers. On one of the songs we did, and memory muscle, I learned everything. I knew exactly all the splits you just played. I was not a fan of program changes during the song. I like to have everything out there, which is why I use multiple controllers, because then everything's there and it's just there all the time. You just play. So I had one song we were doing. It was either I Have the Touch or No Self-Control was one of the things, both of which have this loop. in them.
Yes.
And basically, I would start off the thing and I would go boing, and it would start the loop. We do this show. It was up in Buffalo at the Tralf, which is a well-known venue. I do it. Nothing happens. Do it again. Nothing happens. I'm panicking. This was still early days. You know, I think this was the first or second tour. I still wasn't used to all this thing. It's like, Jesus. So I'm like telling, you know, do something else. But anyway, Trey comes over to me. He was so kind. He sat down beside me and said, relax, think this through, blah, blah, blah. So I'm trying again. Nothing happens. I rebooted my computer. Nothing happens. And I'm like going, I'm like, talk about pressure. You know, there's all these people to the stage. I'm sure somebody's going to throw a tomato at me in a minute, you know. And then it suddenly hit me. Wait. Normally, I have my keyboards. Now, remember, I'm facing out there. So the audience is here. So there's the audience. I normally have keyboards here and keyboards here. Because of the layout of the stage in the Tralf and where the door was for coming on, which was in the middle, my keyboards were rotated. So actually, it was my right hand. I was kind of used to doing this, but in fact, I needed to do this. Wrong keyboard. You know, I was just so used to it. And then I suddenly realized, oh shit, my keyboards are different. I have wrong keyboard. And that's all it was. But I mean, I felt terrible.
Yeah, that's funny. I love it.
You know, you know, there's been other screw-ups. Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, that intro, in the early days, there were a couple of times I screwed it up royally. And so, you know, I ended up, Trey thought this was hysterical. So I'm playing the thing, and I went wrong. So I just went, blah, 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 pooh, that's the thing. And everybody cracked up. And then Trey came up to me afterwards. He goes, that was awesome, man. And he meant it. And I'm like, I was dying. So, yeah, you know.
I love it.
Yeah, but
two great ones, David.
For the most part, I've learned it well enough that it becomes automatic. And I kind of have a vaguely sad example of that. We were on tour in Poland, in part of Europe, and my mother died. And I got a call just before the show that she died. The funeral was going to be the next day. But I had to do the show. We were there. So I'm doing the show, and of course I'm thinking about everything. And my son has to drive down to meet my wife, and then the two of them are going to get on the plane. And I'm busy playing. And, you know, it's so automatic. I got through the whole show fine and then flew home. And it reminded me, there's this great description, the difference between an amateur, and I'm an amateur. Yes, I've gotten paid and blah, 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 but this has not been my career. The difference between an amateur and a pro, you've probably heard this before, but I think it's so accurate. An amateur practices so that they don't make any mistakes. A pro practices so that they can't make any mistakes. Yeah. And you know what? It's dead right. You do it, it becomes just so automatic. And that's why I made that mistake, because of muscle memory. I just did what I always did. My keyboards were in the wrong place.
That's right.
But for the most part, you're playing, you're doing what you need to do, blah, 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 and everything just works.
I hadn't actually heard that one, Dave. That's a great piece of advice. I love that.
It's dead right.
Yeah, it's absolutely dead right. No, thank you. Now, due to time, we're down to our last two questions. We always ask our guests to tag another keyboard player. So is there a player out there that you've always admired, David, that you'd love to hear more about their story?
So that's a funny one. My hero is Keith Emerson, which, by the way, the first time I heard ELP, when I was a teenager, I was in England, I bought an album, I was like, what the hell is this? And I didn't listen to them for another 10 years. I didn't understand what they were doing. He became my hero in terms of just composition and playing. Chick Corea, Joe Zawinul.
Yeah.
Rick Wakeman used to, I found he kind of, after his first couple of albums, which I thought were terrific, it became too like the same for me. I found, you know, Keith Emerson, right until the day he died, was still doing new stuff and being more, you know. But I will be very honest with you. I have never followed the people.
Yeah.
My position was, okay, you're a musician, you're great, I love your music, I want to play more of it or listen to it, but what you do in your personal life, that's your personal life.
That's right.
I was on the Cruise to the Edge once. Remember? I don't know if you know about that.
Yep.
I went to one of those it was great, but I'm sitting down at lunch with a bunch of people and they're all talking, One guy starts talking to me, and he's telling me all about Yes. Yes was playing the thing. And he's telling me, John Anderson owns the LLC, and this guy owns that, and blah, blah, and this is what... I'm like, what? It's like, Close to the Edge is one of the greatest albums ever. I don't care who owns the LLC. No. So I can't answer that beyond I admire the music. In the rock world, there's a couple of classical pieces that I think are just tremendous. But in the rock world, it'd be Keith Emerson, it would be Joe Zawinul, Chick Corea with Return to Forever. There's some guitarists that I think were phenomenal as well. Al Di Meola, for example, comes to mind. Just gorgeous players. What's his name from Focus? Oh, God.
Oh, yeah.
Not Tyson Lear is the Jan Ackerman.
Oh, yes.
Absolutely gorgeous player. And you listen to some of those guys and it's like just beautiful.
Yes. No, great picks. Appreciate it. Now, one question we usually ask, but we don't need to, and I'm going to quickly read them out, David, because I wouldn't expect you to remember them. But from your Weekend Warrior profile, you chose 5 Desert Island discs, and I'll read them out quickly. Genesis, Selling England by the Pound, Holst, the Planets, Close to the Edge, you've just mentioned from Yes, Heavy Weather from Weather Report, and the iconic Brain Salad Surgery from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Great picks. That's the quickest Desert Island discs ever. Now I'll go to the last question, which is our quick fire 10, David, which is quick, short and sharp answers to 10 what are hopefully not too hard questions. First album you ever heard?
With all respect, I'm old.
That's right. It's a long way back.
I'd like had 45s and listening to like pop songs as a kid. My father used to tease me, "She loves me, yeah," when I was a kid.
That's as good as anything. No, that's good. Before you do play a gig, David, what is an important ritual to you? What do you need to do to feel settled before a gig?
Fair enough. I don't have any superstitious rituals. I never understood that stuff. I do, however, get to a show early and set everything up so that if there is a problem with anything, I have plenty of time to sort it out.
You're a man after my own heart. Love it.
I don't like this last minute. I tell our customers, by the way, if you're touring, do not update your computer, even with a gig performer, anything within 2 weeks of a tour.
That's
so
right.
If you have a problem, you have plenty of non-stress time to deal with it.
Exactly.
So early, make sure everything just works. Computer boots up, cables are connected. My front of house is like 10 seconds. I feed them 8 channels of pink noise. I said, set your trims to 0 and you're done with me.
There you go. Oh, I love that. Yeah, it's a great idea, the pink noise. I think you've already flagged the answer to this, but I'll ask it anyway. If you hadn't been a musician, what do you think your career choice would have been?
Well, being a musician isn't my career choice.
True.
I'm a computer scientist by training.
That's right.
I had an absolutely great time living in the research world and doing all sorts of crazy stuff, including, by the way, running a computer music research group for about 6 years at IBM.
I haven't even flagged, and I know you're not the sort of person to flag these things, but you've got a PhD, don't you, in computer science related area?
Yeah, in computer science, yeah.
Yeah. So,
ironically, the use of sound and sonification for debugging code.
Oh, wow.
So you can listen to bugs. Yeah.
There you go. That's amazing.
Yeah, it was a long time ago.
Yeah. Favorite tour you ever done? I'm guessing it was that wonderful tour of Europe, but feel free to contradict me.
The tour in Europe certainly goes down as a thing to I guess. I mean, that's really the only big tour. Yeah. All the others were tours in the US, like within a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
This thing was a month long living on a tour bus.
Yes.
The worst days and the best days all mixed together.
Exactly.
I got to a point where I took a half a sleeping pill every night before getting into this little berth on the tour bus while the guy was driving over the Swiss Alps mountains in the snow at 70 miles an hour.
Yeah. I'm hearing you. Yeah. Favorite gig you've ever done, if that's possible?
My favorite gigs have always... Okay, so I guess there's 2 answers to that. One is when I first fell into doing gigs at theaters.
Yeah.
I loved... I'm here, the drummer's way there, blah, 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 and you're in this zone of your own, and I use in-ear monitoring with molded in-ears, so I'm only hearing living room levels of myself. You're in this isolation chamber kind of thing, doing your own thing, and everything else just happening. I've always loved that.
Yeah.
My favorite local, there's a place called Daryl's House.
Yes.
You know Daryl's house in Pauling, New York.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
I've played there about 5 to 6 times a year with all 3 bands that I've been in.
Wow.
And that's my favorite venue as a club because it's so musician friendly.
Yes.
I just played there, actually. We just played there a couple of weeks ago. Full house. We did the entire The Wall.
Amazing.
And we're going back again in August already. They already booked us again. But I just love that place.
Yeah, no, great pick. Favorite city you've ever played, David?
Probably Tokyo. When we went to Japan, we did Tokyo and Osaka, I think it was.
Yeah.
And that was just what a different culture.
Yes.
And we turned it into. My wife came with me. She never comes things on tour. Obviously, she's not stupid, but she came, and then we turned it into a 2-week vacation. That was fascinating.
That's brilliant. No, I love
that was a great experience.
Yeah. Name a song that you used to love, but you've played it to death and maybe don't like it so much anymore.
There are songs that I used to play that I never liked.
Oh, yep.
Does that count?
Yes, it does.
So when I got back into playing in the early 2000s, I was in a local kind of weekend warrior band in the town where I lived. We did a bunch of gigs, and they did a lot of just pop songs and covers and very repetitive stuff. So there'd be like a Creedence Clearwater, there'd be Rolling Stones. I had an ad once that said, "Looking for a band. If you want to play Rolling Stones, don't call me." I really wrote that. I don't like monotonous stuff.
Yeah.
There has to be color and nuance and change.
Yeah. Reasonable.
Really, just kind of just straight covers like that. I got bored with.
Yeah. No, reasonable. Favorite music documentary or movie?
I have not seen that many. I think the one about Queen was very good.
Yeah.
But was it what was, I forget what it was called.
Oh, you mean the movie Bohemian Rhapsody?
Was it called? Yeah, it was a documentary.
Yeah, the biopic. Oh, there's also, no, you're right. There's also a great documentary. So, yeah, I know the one.
Well, there's a movie as well. Yes, you're right. I mixed them up. I thought that was fabulous. The Bob Dylan one we just saw recently was actually very interesting. I don't listen to words much, so it's like Manfred Mann, who's a band that I really admire. I didn't know there was a song I was listening to. My wife said, "That's a Bob Dylan song." I said, "Oh, is it?" I didn't know that. Yeah. But they were very interesting. As I said, I don't really follow the musicians, so
no, that's right.
I'll tell you what was great. There was a documentary about session musicians and the impact they have, and all the stuff. LA session musicians. I don't remember the name.
But I know the one you mean. I've watched it about 3 times. Yeah, I know. It's great. Yeah, I know the one you mean. Yeah, it was. Name one thing you'd like to see invented that would make your life as a keyboard player easier. I'd argue you've already done it, but anything you want to suggest there?
Honestly, if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be off building it.
That's right. I'd argue you've already done it with Gig Performer, but yes.
Well, I mean, there is that. You know, I wish somebody would come out with a really nice weighted controller with a built-in audio interface that's class compliant, by the way, so you don't have to install drivers, that would have like 8 outs.
Yeah.
Because I use up to 4 stereo pairs, sometimes 3 and a sub and a click track. And I wish there was a controller that had that, and it would have to be like RME type driver quality, because I use an RME interface now. That damn thing is just flawless.
Yeah. No, I like it.
So I'd love to see that. And I looked at NAMM and I saw a couple of things and said, "You've got a great audio interface. You've got a nice keyboard controller. Why don't you put them together?"
Exactly.
I would like that. That would slim me down a bit.
No, great suggestion. And last but not least, your favorite non-musical activity or hobby. What keeps you sane outside of this insane business?
I have a lot of hobbies that I'm involved in. I'm a ham radio operator, photographer. I read, I snow ski, I used to water ski. I have a lot of different interests. Reading probably relevant. And I still keep up with a lot of technical stuff so that you don't get left behind.
And you certainly haven't been left behind with what you're doing with Gig Performer, let alone what you're doing with playing. I can't thank you enough, Dave. It's been an absolute pleasure. Like all of our guests, we've barely scratched the surface, but we love the fact that you've spent this hour with us.
Happy to. Back at you. I appreciate your taking the time.
And there we have it. I hope you enjoyed that chat with David. I know I'm very enthused to go off and have another go at Gig Performer. I know Mainstage can be incredibly reliable, and probably the reason it's somewhat unreliable for me is user error, not Mainstage's issue, but I am keen to check this out. And as I said in the show, we're in no way sponsored by Gig Performer. We say it like it is, but I just feel a bit enthused to go check it out. Thank you, as always, for listening, and a big shout-out to our gold and silver sponsors. So the wonderful Tammy Catch from Tammy's Musical Stew. Thank you, Tammy, as always. The wonderful Ed from Elk Electronic, particularly if you're Australia-based and need some great synth repair or other advice, Ed is the guy. If you Google Elk, ELK Electronic, ending in K as well, you'll find Ed's work. And he also produces his own amazing little modules, both synth modules, and I know he's just done a CV controller for lighting. I think it is called the Color, KOLOR. Do check that out. So thank you to Ed. A big thanks to Mike at Midnight Mastering, as always, too. Wonderful mastering services and mixing services. Do check out Midnight Mastering. And last but very not least is Dave Bryce and the team at the musicplayer.com forums. Still going from strength to strength. Lots of great discussions. I know I've been involved in a couple of chats there this week on things as varied as the Viscount Legend 1, which I'm still drilling to order one once we get some Australian stock, through to a whole bunch of stuff about AI and much, much more. So do check that out. Again, thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. And until then, keep on playing.